Hello, I'm Nell Dunlap. I'm here with Dr. Richard Lynch, and we are just talking about his time in the war. This is episode 6 of War Stories for Senior Center Television. All right, can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to sign up for the Army or how that came about?
That was an interesting story. I knew I was going to get drafted because it was the Korean War and I was waiting for a draft notice, and I had quit high school, and my father, who was a tough old Irishman, said I needed to get a job, and I said, well, there's no sense of getting a job because I'm going to get drafted any day now. But he insisted I get a job, so I went down to the post office and signed up, and my strategy was the first service that could take me got me. So I went down there, and the Navy was the shortest waiting list, and so I signed up.
All right. And what was the first thing you did in the Navy?
The first thing I did, they put me on a train going to Chicago to go to Great Lakes training station. I walked into this enormous building. They had us take off all our clothes, and they put a big mattress cover over us, each of us, and we walked down past these long tables, and people threw shoes and socks and T-shirts, and we held the bag out, and you got all your stuff. You yelled out your size. And then after the end of that, you sat down in a chair, put some clothes on, and a barber started to cut your hair and would say, how would you like it done? As he just shaved you right down to your skull. Okay? So that was my first experience with the military.
Did you have other friends that were in either the Navy or different parts of the military?
Oh, most of my friends either got drafted or had enlisted, yeah. So when I went in, most of my friends were already gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have some friends that were, objectors or were not in the Army?
Not objectors, but there were some of my friends had heart conditions or other sorts of things that made them 4F, so they didn't go. But most people went.
Okay. And when you first joined, did you feel, were you excited about it? Were you nervous?
I was really excited. I was going to get a chance to see the world. It was great. I really had a great time. And on the way to Chicago, we lived in luxury for an overnight because we went on a Pullman, and each of us had our own bunk on a Pullman. And
what's a Pullman?
it's a car in the train where there's during the day there are seats down below, and in the evening the porter comes through and folds them down and brings down these two nice bunks with curtains, fancy velvet curtains. I thought, yeah, the Navy's not a bad life.
So after you got your hair cut, what was the next thing that happened?
Oh, then we spent the next 10 weeks in training, and a lot of that was marching, going to class, learning Navy nomenclature, learning how to tie knots, although my wife still says I don't know how to tie good knots, and just learning how to be a sailor. And a lot of it was discipline and sort of provocative behavior by the Navy to sort of amputate you from civilian life. So they did crazy things like woke you up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go shovel a parking lot that was not used for parking anymore, but just to get out there to show them that we can make you shovel snow at 4 o'clock in the morning whether you like it or not. And so a whole lot of exercise like that. Yeah. And then learned safety things, learned a lot of fireman's type work. So you know, if you're on a ship, you know how to handle a fire. So we spent a lot of time with fire hoses and going inside of burning buildings, which were metal buildings or parts of ships on parking lots. They'd throw gasoline in and start it, and then you had to go in and put it out. And then learning how to abandon a ship. And they did that in a big swimming pool, like an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And what they would do is they put you in a harness, and they rolled you out like a clothesline over the middle of the pool, and you were up about 30 or 40 feet, and then they let the catch go, and down you went into the pool. And you had to pass a swimming test and learn how to stay afloat and do a bunch of things like that. And along the way, there were classes to give you some idea of the different kinds of specialty areas you might apply for to go to school, to be a radioman or to be a metalsmith or what have you.
And did you do any of those? Did you?
Yeah, I did those, and I got assigned to go to a naval aviation school in Oklahoma, and that was another nice Pullman ride out to Oklahoma. And when I got there, I thought we were going to go for 10 weeks of training in naval aviation, But as we walked into the big barn-like structure, the arrival hall, after a whole bunch of us had passed this chief petty officer, he said, "Stop here, you guys go that way." And so I was with the you guys and went that way. And we were assigned to KP for 8 weeks. So for 8 weeks, we didn't start school. We just got up every morning and learned how to scrub pots and pans and serve food and do all those great things. And after 8 weeks, we started our classes. Yeah.
And what does KP stand for?
Kitchen Patrol.
Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah.
And so what is naval aviation?
Naval aviation, it's a way to, most people when they think about the Navy, they think about the ships. But a certain amount of the naval effort on aircraft carriers and on land naval stations involves airplanes and helicopters. And so this was a way to introduce you to some of the specialties in naval aviation that you could then go to school. And it was a matter of, if you did well testing, then you stayed in the system and they keep sending you to school. Right. So I was able to do pretty well testing. So when I finished the aviation school, I had the choice of going to a bunch of different specialty schools, and I picked meteorology. And I did that because that was the closest to New York City where I lived, so I could go home on a weekend once in a while. So I did that.
So what did you learn with that, with meteorology?
Meteorology, well, the actual weather forecasting is done by advanced trained meteorologists. What I was an enlisted man, and so what I did was learned how to observe weather, measure weather, send up balloons, and then the balloons have radios on them and they send the signals back. Learn how to decode a lot of information, and learn how to plot these big weather maps. The weather maps are like the size of a big beach towel, and you sit there and you write down for each reporting station, be it a ship or a land station, the wind, the temperature, the humidity, all this sort of stuff. And it all goes into a space on the map about the size of a 25-cent piece. So you learn how to write small and write legible. And usually what you do, one guy sits over here and reads the stuff and decodes it and tells you what it means, and you write this on these little 25-cent areas. Yeah.
And so that's like then your officer or somebody would look at that map and decide, where you should go.
Right. After we were done, then an officer would come in and analyze the map and then make the weather forecast. And so when I was finished, I knew that the nice thing about going to weather school was that it was close to New York. And the other thing about it was that the weather people in the Navy were usually assigned to really interesting places. So they assigned you to the Antarctic or the Arctic or places in Alaska. Mostly places where they couldn't get civilians to go work as weather people. So when I finished weather school, they sent me to Kodiak Island, Alaska.
Wow.
And so I spent about 15 or 16 months there. And that was a great experience. Lots of snow. They had they actually had a skiing lodge on the base that was free, and it was the social life was pretty poor. It was just around a bunch of guys all the time. Right. But otherwise, it was okay.
When you were in school, did you have any particular instructors that you remembered later on, or that were, did you feel like you had a mentor when you were learning?
It was not so much. It was, the military does it as sort of a group exercise. Okay. They were very good at what they did, and they were kind of demanding. There were lots of exams, and if you didn't keep up, you'd be dropped out and sent somewhere else instead of finishing and become what people call a deck ape. A deck ape is a sailor who doesn't have any specialty except maintenance. So they spend their time chipping paint and putting new paint back on and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, that's a good name.
Deck apes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so once you got to Alaska, you were there for 15 or 16 months.
Right.
What was most shocking about that?
Oh, it was just beautiful. It was just gorgeous, mountains and snow. And because it was kind of an isolated place, it was fairly informal. They didn't really care too much if you were all dressed military and saluting and all this stuff. It was sort of low-key, which was very nice about it. And most of the time you worked because there was very little else to do except in the nice time of the year, like spring, fall, and summer. It was nice, and you could go hiking, and the sun stayed up, sometimes 24 hours a day. Yeah. So a lot of things to do. In the wintertime was dark nothing. You worked and you listened to the radio. One of the things we used to do was listen to Radio Moscow, which had a really good signal in Alaska, and it had the best American jazz of any of the stations that we could get. And then in between the jazz, there'd be some propaganda about the United States, but
mostly just jazz.
Mostly jazz, yeah.
So did you have any say in in going to Alaska? Like, I mean, did you get to choose between places, or mostly they just?
Well, yeah, what they did was a pretty fair system. What they did is, on your final exam, when you finished school, the person who had the highest score got the first choice on the list. So there'd be a list, say, of if there were 50 people in class, then there were 50 assignments. And so you got first choice. I didn't get first choice. I got about third or fourth choice. And I thought Alaska would be great, you know. At the outdoors, bears, Eskimos.
Yeah, did you see any Kodiak bears?
Oh, yeah, saw Kodiak bears. Because the station was out in the boondocks.
Yeah.
So, we saw Kodiak bears. Yeah. And I was sorry that I wasn't really more interested in nature, because there was a lot of really interesting natural things of birds and sea life and stuff, but I wasn't at a point in my life where I was interested in that very much.
Have you been back up there? Have you been back to Alaska?
Yeah, about 4 years ago, Nancy and I drove up in our Volkswagen van and camped all the way up and back, and we were gone about 5 weeks. It was fabulous. Wow. Yeah, I'd love to do it again.
So were you aware of what was going on with the rest of the war when you were in Alaska? Like what was going on? Or?
Oh, I knew about it because some of my friends who were in Korea, once in a while I'd get a letter from one of them, or my mother would send me a letter saying she talked to this guy's mother and he's doing this and this, or this guy got shot, or this guy got sent home, or what have you. So I knew a bit about that. And my brother was in the Marines in Korea. And so my mother would tell me what she could about what was happening with him. And he was in some bad stuff in Korea. So I was lucky. I mean, I was in during the war, but I had a nice assignment. It was every night I went to bed in a nice warm bed.
Right. Well, okay, so what happened after Alaska?
So after Alaska, I went back to a land station near Seattle, Washington. And I was there for about 5 or 6 months. And I was really lucky because the land station, it was a naval air station, officially was closed.
Okay.
But they had a skeleton crew of people on the base because it was an emergency landing strip for military planes in the Pacific Northwest. So they wanted to have the runways open and maintained, and a weather person there. So we had about maybe 10 weather people there. And it was really a soft assignment. You could wear civilian clothes off the base, and you didn't have to work very hard. So it was really soft. And after I was there about maybe 5 or 6 months, I got assigned to a mission to the Arctic Ocean on a very small ship. And that was an exciting prospect to think about going to the Arctic. The ship that we went on, you know, before global warming, when you tried to take a ship along the top of Canada on the Arctic Ocean, you could never do it except for a couple of months in the summer because it's all frozen right up to the beach. Right. But during the summer, in those days, there was enough melting that you could get a ship, if it had a very shallow draft rather than a big long keel, you could crawl yourself away along the shoreline and go all the way across. So I was on something called an LST, which was a real flat-bottom ship. It carried about 70 people.
Do you know what that stood for, LST?
Yeah, it's called for Landing Ship Tank. Okay. So maybe you remember seeing these old war pictures where there were these ships that were long, like an enormous freight car, and they ran them up on the beach, and the doors opened, and the tanks came out.
Yeah, I think I've seen that before.
Yeah, so that's what this was. But we didn't carry tanks. We carried drums of gasoline. And our mission was to go to a place roughly north of Chicago in the Arctic Ocean, in the archipelago north coast of Canada, and to begin the first steps of building an airfield there. Wow. So we were bringing the gasoline up for that, and small pieces of Caterpillar-like equipment to start scraping. And we just delivered it, okay? And then other people from the Army stayed there and used the equipment. And after a while, they were able to land a Piper Cub, and then they do a little more work and get a bigger. And in a year or so, they were able to land big multi-engined airplanes there. And they were constructing what was called the DEW line, D-E-W, which meant detect early warning. And they were worried because of the Cold War of missiles coming from the Soviet Union to the North American continent. And so these radar stations they put up had airfields connected with them for maintenance purposes. And it was a liner that went all the way across the Arctic to detect the early warning of missiles, incoming missiles to the United States. So that was the purpose of the trip.
And so the radars would see if they could tell if the missiles were coming in. Like
yeah, right.
And do you know how much time there would be between when the radar sensed
very
it
short. It was a lot of money spent by the government for maybe 4 or 5 minutes of time, reactive time.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting to go there because the place that we finally ended up north of Chicago, when we first got there, it was total nothingness, just flat as far as you could see. On the ice, once in a while you'd see a polar bear. And in the water, once in a while you see a small whale or walruses or things like that. And after we were there about 4 or 5 days, one day I looked out there and there were a whole bunch of people walking across the tundra. And they were native people who, I don't know how, I never really understood or learned how they knew we were there. But they came because they knew there were ships there, and they knew from their parents that wooden ships had come in the past there, but these were metal ships, and they wanted to see these metal ships, so they walked all the way across the tundra and stayed for a couple of days, and then one day they just walked back and disappeared.
How were you able to communicate with them?
No, they stayed on the beach, and I was not able to. Possibly some other people did, but I think they had their native language. And
do you remember what they were wearing to stay warm on the beach? Or
it was interesting because some of the kids, they had parkas, and it was summer time, so to them it was warm. And actually the kids were playing in the water, and the water had ice in it, but they were running around the water like kids run around at Coney Island. Yeah, no, they weren't going full immersion, but they were running around up to their knees and splashing each other and having a great time. Oh
my gosh. Okay. And when you were on this mission, you were doing what you had been trained to do, which is, making these weather maps. And
we had learned in preparation for that trip, we had learned to observe ice.
Okay.
And so the whole bunch of features about ice that you can record and that helps you in terms of predicting the ice movement and thickness and stuff. And we were supported by airplanes that flew over the ice cap and would tell us information about what was further out than we could see. And the whole idea was they didn't want these ships to get trapped up there for the winter, so they wanted to unload as fast as they could and then get out of there before the wind shifted and started to be onshore, and before it got so cold that it froze in.
Right.
And one of the other things that was supposed to happen but didn't happen, there were some explorers in the past that tried to go through what was called the Northwest Passage. Back in even before the turn of the 20th century, merchant seamen had hoped to find a passage from the east coast of the United States across the top of Canada to get to the Pacific without having to go underneath South America.
Right.
And this passage was the so-called Northwest Passage. And no one had ever been able to succeed there. There were a lot of interesting stories about ships that almost made it. So we were supposed to complete the Northwest Passage, and where we were supposed to be met by an icebreaker and a bunch of other ships that came from Boston over the east side.
So this would have been the first time that
this would have been the first time. Okay. But there was so much ice, even those guys couldn't get through, so we didn't succeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Too bad, almost though. Sounds like you got close.
We got very close. Nowadays, with global warming, it's very common for ships to make the Northwest Passage. Yeah.
Okay.
Then I went back to Seattle, and back to the country club living of living on a military base that officially is closed. And after I was there for a while, maybe 4 or 5 months, probably closer to 4 months, I got new orders to go to San Diego, and I was assigned to a ship. And we didn't know where we were going. People were speculating about where we were going. Some people thought we were going to go to the Antarctic.
Right.
Some people thought we were going to go to Asia, but it was a lot of just speculation. Yeah. So we made it across the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii, and we stopped at Hawaii and had a weekend there, which was great.
Yeah.
And we still didn't know where we were going. So after the weekend was up, we got back on the ship and motored out. And a couple of days after we left Hawaii, the captain had an announcement saying we're going to Bikini in the Marshall Islands, which is about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And we're going to be the command ship for what was called Operation Red Wing, which was a series of 17 hydrogen bomb explosions. And this was all going to be orchestrated from the ship that I was on. And my job and the other guys in the weather crew was to provide weather information for those tests.
So what did you know about the hydrogen bomb before you went there? Did you know anything?
I knew basically zip. You know, in high school I was not an inspired student, so the only science course I'd ever taken was in biology, and it was in a parochial school, and the biology teacher that year was, I don't know, sick or on leave, so a brother taught the course, and he taught more religion than biology, and so I didn't know much about science at all.
Right.
Yeah, and so when I went out there, I just assumed, well, the government knows what they're doing, so I'll be okay.
Okay. All right, so what happened when you first got there? And what did they tell you about what your mission was or what you were going to be doing?
Yeah, they didn't tell us much. A lot I learned later on. They told us a little bit. They told us that we were not going to be in any danger, that there was radiation that was associated with each blast, but that we would be safe distance from the radiation and would wear protective eye goggles so that it wouldn't injure our eyes and stuff. And that we would all wear dosimeter badges which would detect radiation. And these were like, little, like these things you stick in computers, what do you call them?
Like a disc,
yeah,
or a disc or something.
And they were made of plastic, and they had a little film inside of it, so any radiation would make little dots on the film. And on the outside, it had a piece of some kind of a chemically treated paper that was usually blue. But if you were started to be exposed to radiation, the paper gradually turned pink. So if you looked down and you saw your paper was pink, you knew you were being radiated.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's basically what they told us. We got there early in May, and for the first 3 weeks, we did a lot of planning, a lot of weather balloon launching, a lot of weather analysis and stuff. And after we were there 3 weeks, we had our first test. Now, the Navy had told us that government policy required a certain fraction of the crew to be official observers of each test. So that meant a certain number. It seemed to me that it was almost the majority of the crew. I certainly was an observer at all 17 tests, and most of the people I knew were also observers at all the tests too. And so they had taught us what to do when the bomb was going to be detonated. So basically what they did is they scheduled the detonations for about a couple of minutes after 6 in the morning. And the reason for that is that the dawn light had not yet really come up on the surface, okay? But up at 40 or 50,000 feet, daylight was up there.
Right.
And so they wanted, when the bomb went off, to be able to see the funnel cloud, and it was lit way up there, okay? And so what we did is, for the first test, which was a test that exploded a hydrogen bomb from a tower on one of the islands, and the bomb was about 3 times greater than the bomb they dropped on Hiroshima.
Wow.
And so what we did is early in the morning we went up on deck, we were told where to sit, and they gave us these goggles, and the goggles were basically totally opaque. When you put them on, you couldn't see anything. You looked like an alien, these big things on your face. And then what you would do is, as the countdown approached 0, you would put your face in your elbow and put your elbow between your knees, and ground 0 would be behind you.
Okay.
And you'd hear the countdown and then the explosion. And we were told we wouldn't see anything or feel anything. And so the first test, which I say was 3 times the Hiroshima bomb, it went just as they said. We didn't see anything. we didn't feel anything. We heard the noise.
Right. So how are you observers? You were just observing the noise?
Well, I think in retrospect we were guinea pigs. I
Yeah.
think, but at the time we thought, well, this is some
Right.
wizard decide this is a good idea,
Yeah.
you know, and the government's going to do the right thing by you. So not many people questioned it at all, you know. In the military, you get this mentality, you know, yours is not to question why, yours is just to do or
Right.
die, you know, and so you get an order and you carry it out. I mean, even if you thought it was a crazy order, you would never think about questioning it. It ended up in the slammer, you know, so you just did what you were told. But there was no suspicion, you know. It was
Right.
a decade later when the cynicism and skepticism about the government came on scene with the Vietnam stuff and all
Right.
that. Before that, people pretty much trusted the government.
And how long, when your testing was happening, was before Hiroshima? Like the first bomb that like how many years was it from that
Okay,
point?
so Hiroshima was 45,
Okay.
and we're talking about 56. So
Okay, so this is later. So you knew, but you had some information about atom bombs.
oh, we knew that there
about
were atom bombs and
Okay.
that they were terribly destructive,
Right.
and that you got radiation burns, that you didn't just die from the heat and the explosion,
Right.
but if you
Okay.
survived that, you got radiated, and then a lot of people that were radiated got sick and died weeks later, and some of them died years later from a cancer. I mean, everybody
Right.
kind of
You-
knew
okay,
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that was the basic extent of my knowledge. Now, there may have been people on the ship that had gone to college and stuff that knew a lot more about it than I did. But most of the guys that I knew, enlisted men, they had the same level pretty much of information as I did. So the first one went off without any problem. The second one, about a week later, was a bomb that was 300 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb.
Oh.
And so we did the same thing for that. We got up early in the morning, went up on deck and put on our goggles and all that stuff. And when the countdown got down to the final moments, I started to get a little nervous because I didn't know I didn't at the time know it was even 300. I just knew they said it was a big bomb. So when it went off, the countdown officer said, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, detonation. And then within about a second, I heard the loudest sound I ever heard in my life. I felt heat on my back like someone had opened the oven door right behind me. And I saw this bright image, which was like a panoramic orange-yellow image, like in a movie theater. Across the image were two oblong structures that were sort of grayish. And that lasted maybe 7 or 8 seconds, and then it gradually faded.
And this is when your head is led down like
Yeah,
this. Okay.
yeah, and looking the wrong way. You shouldn't see anything because
Right.
all is behind
Yeah.
you. So I panicked because I thought, okay, something's really wrong here. We're not supposed to see anything, and I'm seeing it, and I'm feeling it. And so right away, I concluded that this was doomsday. And I remember thinking, am I going to feel the final finale, or I'm just going to disappear? And so I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally the loudspeaker says, you may sit up, but don't take off your goggles. So then I realized, well, whatever went wrong, we survived at least for a while. Okay? But I was convinced we weren't going to survive at all. So we sat up, and after a period of time, we were allowed to turn around and look towards the ground zero with our glasses on. And we saw this enormous fireball. And being a weatherman, you get good at estimating how high things are. So I knew the top of the cloud was at least at 100,000 feet. Just this enormous fireball.
And it was still burning?
Was still burning. The core was like a core of fire, and the top of it was still, you could see into the cloud. There was so much. So then we watched and watched and watched, and finally the image began to fade, and after a certain amount of time, you couldn't see anything again, okay, because of the goggles. And then they had us turn around and face the ship, and after a little bit of time, they said it's okay to take off the goggles, but don't turn around right away. So when I took off my goggles, I was totally blinded. It was
Yeah.
like looking right into the sun.
Oh my gosh.
And so we waited a while. Then they said, okay, you can turn around and look at the cloud. So we turned around and looked at the cloud, and God, it was enormous, just an enormous thing. I had never imagined anything so big. And it was all big fireball.
And what were people talking about, like, during these minutes or half hour, hour, however long?
That's an interesting question, because initially nobody said anything. The first words I heard were when we turned around with the goggles still on and looked at it. I heard some guy off to my right say, "Holy shit." And that was all I heard,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
And then after we had got the goggles off and we were looking at this cloud, the loudspeaker said, "Stand by to take heavy seas." And what happened?
Does that mean, heavy sea?
I mean, waves are going to come.
Okay,
So
okay,
there was
okay.
a tsunami-like wave that was created
Oh my God.
at the blast site,
Yeah.
and it finally reached the ship. And so as soon as they said that, the ship started to rock, and I grabbed the railing of the ship. If I had not grabbed the railing, I would have got thrown on my butt. I grabbed the railing, and the ship started rocking, and then I heard the second sounds. Some guy said, "Are we going to flip?" Then the waves got lesser and lesser. The first wave was really the big one. The other one was rocked, and clearly we weren't going to flip over. But then it was interesting, because after all the procedure was done and we were allowed to go back to our regular jobs, strange thing, nobody talked about what happened in the morning. No one talked about it. It was if, like, you know, it was so overwhelming, you just didn't know how to talk about it, or you were afraid to talk about it. So no one talked about it at all then. The next morning, we motored to Ground Zero, and it was an amazing experience. When we got to Ground Zero on the ship, there used to be an island there, but the island was gone. And the only reason you knew there was an island there is that where the ocean water went over, there was some turbulence in one spot, and that's where the current was passing over what amounted to be an amputated coral reef. Because the way these islands are formed out in the Pacific, you have a big volcano down on the ocean floor, okay? That at one time maybe was up at the surface or is now moving towards the surface, but as the plates on the Earth change, it changes its altitude. And on top of the rim of the volcano, coral begin to grow, and they make this big coral reef, okay? And on top of the coral reef, stuff that blows in from all over in the wind eventually starts sticking to the coral reef, and you have an island with sand and coconut trees and all that. So all that was gone. The only thing that was left was the amputated coral reef. And I remember looking, nobody said a word. We were all looking at this thing, and no one said anything. And I had the feeling, the thing only that I could think about was, this is like being in a graveyard when they're dropping the casket down in the ground and everybody just sort of, out of respect, doesn't say anything. It was just total silence. And there was over 100 guys standing on the side of the ship looking. Nobody said a word. So that was number 2 of the 17 we had. And that wasn't the biggest one, but that was the second biggest one. And then I began to worry a bit now, because I realized that the prediction we're not going to see anything or hear anything or feel anything isn't absolute.
Did you start having any, like, trust? Did at that point were you sort of questioning, like, do they really know what they're doing, or you were just like, oh?
I was a little bit worried, but I didn't know enough about it to know what to worry about. I was just a little bit apprehensive that, because when I was sitting there waiting for the finale, when I thought the thing was all over, that I was going to die, the things that went through my mind is, what happened? Was there a chain reaction and the bomb was bigger than they thought? Did the ship make a navigation error and we were too close to the island? Did the airplane make a navigation error and they dropped the bomb too close? So all this stuff's going through my head. And then it stopped when the officer announced on the loudspeaker, it's okay to sit up, but don't take off your glasses. So I was apprehensive, but I didn't really know enough about it to know what to really be scared about. And I had no idea about this seeing this thing. I mean, it was just, we weren't supposed to see anything, and I
Right.
saw something.
Right.
I learned years later, as a first-year medical student, I looked at an X-ray of an arm, and I realized that what I saw were the bones in my arm. I didn't realize that then. So I saw my radius and ulnar was what those oblong structures were in the field.
Oh my gosh.
And later on, when I retired and began to write about this, I started to get in touch with people from the ship that I still knew their addresses and stuff, and through the internet, it's so easy to find people. And I found out lots of people saw the bones in their arms. I just was not knowledgeable enough to realize what it was. But some of the people there knew they saw their bones because not everybody followed the instructions.
Yeah.
Some guys had their hands here.
So they could really tell.
So they knew they were looking at their fingers.
Oh my gosh.
But the guys that followed the instructions and had this, they didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
And you know, it isn't interesting because, you know, you would think people talking to each other, but no one talked about it. No one talked about it.
Do you think they were worried about getting in trouble, or just like you were saying, they just didn't even know
I
how
think
to start talking about
I think a combination. A lot of it was trouble, getting in trouble, because they had really made a big deal about secrecy. And not writing home about where you were or what you were doing. You shouldn't take any pictures with cameras or anything like that. And it was interesting because before that bomb where I saw the bones in my arm, just before that happened, we had a bunch of civilians come aboard the ship. Maybe it was probably 2 days before, or maybe the day before the bomb. They came aboard the ship. And most of them were pretty old people, and we had no idea who these guys were. And it turned out, you know, it's hard to keep secrets on a ship. People find out, and then the gossip line goes. So we found out soon that most of these people were reporters, and some of them were Congress people. And one of them was a journalist whose name was Bob Considine. And Bob Considine wrote the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which was made into a movie, very, very successful movie. So he was on there.
Wow.
And I remember when we realized that these guys were on it, were journalists and stuff, we had a Cajun from Louisiana who used to really, I used to talk funny because I was from Brooklyn, but he talked funnier because he was from the boonies in Louisiana. And he said, God, isn't that just like the Navy? They're bringing reporters on here, and they're telling us we can't write anything, and to not to glue your envelopes closed. And he said, isn't that just like the military? Yeah. So that was the exciting part of. There was a second bomb. Then after that, we had pretty much routine bombs, if anything can be considered routine, like that, until we got to bomb number 13. And it was interesting that just by chance it turned out it was bomb number 13. And bomb number 13 solved a riddle that had started right when we first got there, before we even had bomb number 1. Being a weatherman, you're up high on the ship to release the balloons and work up in the weather shack. And very soon after we got to Bikini, some civilians came aboard during that first 3 weeks before the first bomb, and we assumed these must be the scientists and government civilian people from the Atomic Energy Commission and stuff like that. And they were on the ship, and one day I was up there getting ready to launch a balloon, and I looked down on the helicopter deck, which was on the stern of the ship, and there was a guy down there who was probably in his mid or late 50s, had shoulder-length gray hair, so he had a hippie look before they were actually hippies, and he was totally naked, and he was laying on the helicopter deck. And I thought, this is really bizarre, because we got an admiral on the ship, and this guy's down there bare-ass naked, working on his tan. You know, what's going on? So there was a lot of speculation about who this guy was. And with time, I realized he was a scientist, because he would come to the weather briefings every day. Most of the time, he didn't say anything, but he looked like a scientist because he dressed like a scientist. The scientists wore sandals, shorts, raggedy T-shirts. Everyone else was more or less military. and the journalists and stuff, when they came aboard, they were more or less professional looking. But these guys, they didn't look like bums, but they didn't look look like beach people. Okay.
Okay.
So there was a lot of speculation about who this fellow was. Every once in a while at the weather briefing, he would ask a question. And the first time he did that, I recognized he had a German accent. And so I kept track of this guy, and there was a lot of speculation about who he was and what he did. But in the days prior to each test, the group of scientists, including what this guy we call Tan Man, got on the helicopters and left for most of the day because they went over to the island where the bomb was going to be assembled, and they put it together. Okay, most of the bombs were what they call surface shots. A couple of them were dropped from an airplane, but I think 15 out of the 17 were surface shots. So they went over to build the bomb. So I knew he had something to do with building the bomb. And then he'd come back late afternoon. They'd come back. And they would do this for a few days before each test. And then the day of the test, they didn't leave at all. They stayed on the ship, and they orchestrated the detonation electronically from the ship. So on bomb number 13, I was up on deck, and I had my goggles on, my back to ground zero, and so they did the countdown. They got about maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes to zero, and they stopped and said, the test is on hold. Well, every once in a while in the previous test, they would have a pause for, sometimes 15 or 20 seconds, then they'd pick up the count again and do it. But this time the pause lasted several minutes, and they announced again the test is on hold. And then after about 15 minutes, and we're sitting there in the dark with our glasses on, waiting for this, and we're starting to get nervous. What's going on here? After about 15 minutes, the loudspeaker said, abort the test, launch the chopper. And so everybody was allowed to get up from their safety position. So I took off my goggles and I went to the side of the ship, to the railing, and I looked down the helicopter pad because already the engine was going on the chopper. And I see Tan Man. He's running down the deck, and he's in a hurry, and his hair was bouncing in cadence with his feet. He ran up the ladder to the helicopter deck, jumped in the helicopter with the pilot, and just like a raptor leaves a branch on a tree, just gracefully they're gone. Okay. About 20 minutes later, the helicopter came back to the ship, but without Tan Man, just with the pilot. And he landed, and then the orders were, everybody below decks, seal off all the hatches and doorways and portholes, turn off the air handling system. They didn't want any circulation of air. So right then I realized, okay, what's going on here is that they got a bomb over there that they don't know whether it's going to blow up or not blow up. There's some kind of a technical problem. And so I realized what this guy did. And it turned out the pilot of the helicopter left him on the beach, and he walked along the beach and climbed up the 300 feet to the top of the tower and went in a little shack, metal shack up there, and disarmed the hot hydrogen bomb.
Oh my
So
God.
he was a nuclear physicist who was an expert at assembling bombs and disassembling bombs. Even though I wasn't there to see him do it, I could see in my mind this guy walking across the beach and climbing up there. And I'm thinking, what do you think about when you're walking up there and there's a bomb up there and you got to
Go off at
deactivate
any
it?
time. Oh my gosh.
So that turned out to be the story of Tan Man.
So that's why he was allowed to sunbathe naked.
Yeah, right.
They
Yeah,
needed
he was the most important guy. I mean, what could you do to a guy that was willing to do something like that? Yeah. So he was given some extra privilege. After the tests were over, he went back to one of the laboratories, either in California or in New Mexico, where the Atomic Energy Commission had all these nuclear physicists working on tests. Yeah. So that was he was an interesting guy.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so what was the biggest You said that the first one was the second one was the second biggest.
Yeah. So the second one was the second biggest, and that was about 300 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb.
Mm-hmm.
The next to the last, number 16, was about 20% bigger than that. So it must have been almost 400 times the Hiroshima bomb. And that was also a surface shot and also was responsible for an accident. After the bomb had blown off, the winds shifted and blew the cloud over some populated islands and showered down radioactivity on the military people working there, and many of them later developed leukemia and other forms of cancer from the radioactive fallout. I never had any health consequences of the radiation, but I was showered twice. Once we were allowed between tests to go over to some of the islands and play softball. So it was really an interesting experience because over on the islands they held this, it was really beautiful. It looked like what you see in a travel agency, beautiful palm trees and everything. But on the palm trees they had these signs, don't eat the coconuts, they're radioactive. So we were playing softball over there one day, and somebody noticed that their radiation badge was turning pink.
Yeah.
And then the siren on the ship went off, and we all had to hustle back to the ship. And we got back, and they said, okay, all the hatches and portholes closed, everybody below deck, and go through decontamination procedures. The poor deck apes, they had special equipment to wear. So up on top, they're squirting water to get rid of it off the outside of the ship. We all go down, strip down, send our stuff to the laundry. I don't know what the poor guys in the laundry did. I mean, they're getting all this radioactive Levi's and stuff to wash. And then we stayed down there, and the ship motored out of the area, and then we were allowed to go up on deck again. And while we were down there, it was hotter than blazes because you're inside of a ship with an engine going, but no air circulation because they didn't want the radioactivity coming inside. So that was one time when we got showered on. And another time, after a test, we were just at anchor somewhere, and all of a sudden someone realized their badge changed, and then we then went through the same exercise of closing everything down and sending our radioactive clothes to the laundry and motoring out of the area. There were a lot of things about what happened there that were really terrible. We didn't have anywhere near the radiation on our ship that some of the islanders had. You know, when the tests first started in 1946, a year after the war ended, the military, the United States government had been given by the United Nations the responsibility of being trustee for the Marshall Islands, because the Marshall Islands during the war were occupied by Japan. So the United Nations gave the islands to the United States with the idea the United States was supposed to take care of things and bring things along, and sooner or later the Marshall Islanders would become their own nation.
Right.
So one of the first things the United States did was they decided this was a great place to test nuclear weapons because they had tested some out in New Mexico, but those were mostly atomic bombs, not hydrogen bombs. These bombs were way too big to be blowing them up in New Mexico, so they decided these islands out in the Pacific were ideal. So they went to the chief on Bikini, and there were about 160 some odd natives that lived on the island of Bikini. And they talked the chief into moving off the island. And the chief was sort of ambivalent about it, but since the Americans had liberated the islanders from the Japanese, who apparently were pretty bad people in treating the natives, the natives sort of felt obligated to go along with it, and they were told that they'd only be gone for a little while, and that they needed the island to do some testing to develop a weapon that would end wars for all time. There'd never be another war. So they went to another island. The island that they went to was really not inhabitable. It was an unoccupied island, and if you think back historically, where you have a lot of native people and a lot of islands, the ones that they're not living on is because someone tried to live on it and you just can't live. You can't grow food, or there's not good fishing or whatever. So they got put there, and then later got moved to another island. And some of them later on actually had, 2 years before I was there, they had a very large bomb. It was actually 1,000 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. It was called Mike, Big Mike. And when Mike was exploded, there was a big disaster. The wind shifted and it went to the east instead of to the north. And it went over an island called Rongelap, and there were a couple of hundred people living on Rongelap. The day that Mike was exploded, they said they did it about 6 in the morning, there was some fishermen on that island getting their nets ready, and they were going to go out in the lagoon and fish. And they couldn't believe what happened. They saw the sun coming up in the west. And they thought, you know, they're fairly simple people, and they thought somebody's been messing with God, and God's messing with us now, okay? But they had no idea it was a hydrogen bomb.
Right.
And so the sun comes up in the west, and then about 20 minutes later, the sun comes up in the east. And now they're really confused about what's going on. And then a few hours later, about 4 hours later, it started snowing on the island. And at least that's what they thought it was, you know. It was all this ash and stuff coming down. And actually, kids on the island had never seen snow, but they knew what snow was, so they were playing in this stuff. And it was all radioactive stuff. And it was just a disaster. So those people got radiated really heavily. The radiation that I got was probably not very much, because I never had any consequences of it. But they had very severe consequences. Women that were pregnant, delivered babies that were all deformed, just on and on. And then for years after, women who had been radiated, okay, but were not pregnant at the time, later, years later, when they became pregnant and went into labor, instead of delivering a baby, they delivered a big mass that looked like grapes. And what is something called a hydatidiform mole. And what it is the radiation damaged the egg. So the egg got fertilized and had the ability to make an abnormal placenta, but not a fetus. And so these grape-like clusters were abnormal placentas. And so again, they start thinking, oh, someone's messing with God, and God's messing with me. And it was just one tragedy after another of these poor people who were moved off the island for a short period to do something that was going to end wars for all time. So a lot of the tragedy was due to malfeasance on the part of the government and the military. Some of it was due to ignorance. They just didn't know enough about nuclear weapons then. And some of it was due to bad luck. The wind changed or something happened that was not foreseen, and the consequences were just terrible to these poor people whose islands they had lived on for 3,000 or 4,000 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So one of the things maybe I should end telling you about is, as I started to write this stuff and get in touch with other people who were there, I learned a bunch of things. And one of the articles I just wrote, I'll just read from you.
And what is this an article for?
This is going to be published in something called which is the Elks magazine. Okay, it's out of Chicago. It's got a circulation of about 1 million.
Oh my gosh!
And then after it gets published there, Saturday Evening Post is interested in publishing it also.
Yeah.
So I'll read you the last few lines of this thing. 4 years ago, I began to research the 1956 nuclear test at Bikini. I found information that had been classified as secret until Congress made it public in 1992. I spoke with some former shipmates. I learned that half of the radiation dosimeter badges we wore at Bikini were defective. I learned that sailors who had been assigned to certain groups never had safety goggles, while sailors assigned to other groups always had them. I learned that many crew members saw the bones in their arms. I learned that after one test, military personnel on one of the islands was showered with heavy fallout, and some of them later developed leukemia. I learned that the mushroom cap of the hydrogen bomb they exploded the day I saw my bones penetrated the stratosphere, then detached from its stem and expanded eventually covering an area of about 7,000 square miles, roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. I learned that it circumnavigated the globe for years, sprinkling radioactive strontium everywhere it went, strontium that ended up in the growing bones and teeth of children in every country north of the equator. I learned that the journalist had been invited that day because it was the first time a hydrogen bomb got dropped from a B-52, and that the government wanted the Russians and Chinese to know we had the capability to deliver a hydrogen bomb anywhere on the globe. I learned that the bomb they dropped that day missed its target by 4 miles. None of my sources said whether it was 4 miles closer to us than it was supposed to be or 4 miles further away. So a lot of the things I learned later on, if I'd known about them earlier, I probably would have been scared out of my mind.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh my gosh. So how do you feel? I mean, how do you feel now about? Do you feel angry that you were put in that position? Do you feel? I mean, do you think the people that were putting you there knew, you know, as much as they know now?
Oh, I think that there was malfeasance, no question about it. I don't feel angry about it. I feel that it's important that people who don't know about this learn about it. And that's why I'm writing some of these things, because nuclear weapons are just amazing in the sense of the terror and the destruction. It's very easy to make them. Some of the bombs that were at Bikini were thousands of pounds in weight. But nowadays you can make nuclear weapons that are the size of a small computer. So it's important that people not become complacent about nuclear weapons, because you know, they are just awful. And these bombs that we were testing at Bikini were so-called clean bombs. Clean bombs. The atomic bombs that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were called dirty bombs because they had chain reactions that generated all these isotopes. Most of the energy that comes out of the hydrogen bomb is high-energy neutrons, and they dissipate after a while, okay? So there's no lingering. But the thing about the hydrogen bomb, even though they called it a clean bomb, is in order to make a hydrogen bomb, you need a detonator, okay? And the detonator is an atomic bomb. So you have an atomic bomb and then hydrogen bomb. So you can't get away from the radiation and all the terrible consequences that come from that. So no, I don't feel angry. I just feel that it's important that people know about it and do everything they can to prevent any more expansion of nuclear weapons and their use. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for writing this, and thanks for talking today to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
You did a great job.